November 1944. The wind howled through the broken trees, carrying the faint stench of burning wood and the sharp smell of mud-slicked metal. It was a cold, bitter day on the western front of France, yet nothing about the scene felt still. The war was everywhere, clinging to every inch of the earth, and there in the distance a sound rang out that made even the seasoned German soldiers pause and listen. It was the unmistakable growl of an American M4 Sherman tank. For Lieutenant Viktor Gruber, the war had become a series of mechanical nightmares, each battle grinding away at his nerves and will. He had witnessed firsthand how the seemingly invincible machines of the German army had been brought down by the weight of constant combat, the wear of endless engagements, and the relentless pace of attrition. Tanks, as mighty as they were, had a way of falling apart when pushed too far, and there was always another battle to fight, another line to hold. But today, this tank, this American beast, was different. Victor was no stranger to the harsh realities of war. He had fought across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and like many of his comrades, had seen the casualties of armored combat firsthand. His mind was sharp, honed through months of strategy and survival, but even he couldn't deny the sense of awe he felt as he stared at the Sherman coming towards them. This Sherman wasn't the first of its kind to fall into German hands, but there was something different about this one. It had been through the wars, scarred and weathered by time, yet it was still standing tall. As it rumbled through the fog, Victor could hear the engine thrumming with an unsettling, almost predatory rhythm. It was no mere machine, it was an anomaly, a captured Sherman. Victor had heard the stories. He knew about the legendary durability of the American tank, how it seemed to survive anything thrown its way, how its engine just kept going despite the odds. But as he observed it from a distance, there was something unsettling about it, something that gnawed at him in a way he couldn't quite explain. As he stood with his fellow officers, watching the tank approach, a part of him couldn't help but wonder, how had the Americans built such a machine, and how had it survived so much? They were in a small, abandoned French village, tucked away behind a ravaged stretch of woods, the remnants of a dozen different battles visible in the surrounding ruins. A small group of German engineers led by Hauptmann Keller had already begun inspecting the tank, tearing into it, analyzing its mechanics with a mix of fascination and frustration. Victor was ordered to oversee the process, his keen eye a necessary part of evaluating the tank's potential as a weapon to turn the tide for the Germans. The engineers had already been working through the night, peeling away the tank's outer layers, trying to find weaknesses, the chinks in the armor that might explain how the Americans had maintained such an edge for so long. There was no room for failure. The Germans were on the back foot, their supply lines thinning, and with the Allied forces advancing relentlessly, every new advantage was vital. As Victor entered the small workshop where the Sherman had been dragged for examination, he was greeted by the clinking sounds of tools and the murmurs of the engineers. One of them, a young man with wide, nervous eyes, stepped forward to greet him. "Lieutenant Gruber," he said, his voice tight with suppressed excitement, "we've barely scratched the surface, but you should see this." Victor nodded silently and walked over to the machine. The sight of it sent a jolt through his chest. It was an odd thing to say about a piece of war machinery, but this tank seemed alive. Its very presence seemed to challenge the war-torn surroundings. Unlike the gleaming, battle-ready tanks of the German army, the Sherman was worn, scarred by months of relentless combat, yet it retained a rugged strength that commanded attention. The engineers had already removed the turret, revealing the massive engine that had powered the machine through countless battles. The exposed components were strangely unremarkable. There was no advanced German technology here, no cutting-edge designs to marvel at. Everything was, in a sense, simplistic, but that was what made it even more baffling. How could something so simple withstand the horrors of war? "Look here," Hauptmann Keller called out, his voice cutting through the haze of confusion. He was standing at the back of the tank, one hand pointing at the engine. "It's not what we expected. No complicated systems, no over-engineered solutions, but somehow it works, and it keeps working." Victor stepped closer, peering down at the engine, running his fingers over the exposed parts. The metal was worn, but not damaged beyond repair. It's designed for durability, not for show, he muttered. It wasn't a question. He was trying to make sense of it, to understand why a tank so rudimentary could have such an enduring reputation. Keller's voice was laced with disbelief. You don't understand. This thing has been hit multiple times. It's been through artillery fire, machine gun bursts, and yet it keeps going. It's as if it was built to survive. Victor's mind raced. This was not a luxury the Germans had in their own machines. They had built their tanks to be precise, powerful, and overwhelming. The Tiger and Panther were engineering marvels, but they had a fatal flaw: their complexity. The Sherman, by contrast, was robust. It wasn't built to be the best in any one category, but it was built to endure. And endurance, Victor realized, was something the Germans had overlooked. But before he could process his thoughts further, the engine sputtered to life. The deep, throaty growl of the Sherman's motor sent a shiver down his spine. It was as if the tank was waiting for something, waiting for them to push it further. Suddenly, the hangar door slammed shut, and all eyes turned to the engineers, who had been standing around the Sherman. They had a new task ahead. This tank would be tested. Keller turned to Victor, his face serious now. We need to see what it can do. We're putting it to the test. It's the only way to know how to beat it. Victor felt a cold rush of adrenaline. He had faced countless machines on the battlefield, but none like this. It was more than just metal and oil. It had something else, something he couldn't quite name. It was time to see if the Sherman could break. The air in the workshop hung thick with the scent of oil and metal. Outside, the wind picked up again, howling through the skeletal remains of the village. The sky had darkened, casting an oppressive shadow over the small group gathered around the captured Sherman tank. Lieutenant Viktor Gruber stood at the back of the room, his eyes fixed on the machine. The engineers were making final adjustments, checking every piece with meticulous precision. It was all business now. There was no room for hesitation, no time for doubt. But Victor felt something stirring deep inside him, an unease he couldn't explain, a tightening in his chest. He had seen machines like this before, but never one so relentless. Behind him, the engineers continued to discuss their plans. Keller, the lead engineer, was speaking with Sergeant Weber, his voice steady but strained. I don't know, Hauptmann, Weber said, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. Something about this tank. It's not like the others. It doesn't make sense. How does it survive day in and day out, through all this punishment? How is it still running? Keller's eyes narrowed as he adjusted the tools in his hands. It doesn't matter how it survives. What matters is that it does survive. That's the key, and we're going to find out how. It's not just the enemy we have to fight, it's this machine. If we understand it, we can use that knowledge. Victor shifted uncomfortably. He had heard these words too many times in his life. The Germans had always been obsessed with understanding. It was their strength, their greatest weapon in the war. But something about the Sherman unsettled him. It wasn't just a piece of machinery to be dismantled. It was a symbol of something far greater, the relentless, undying will to survive. A voice broke through his thoughts. Lieutenant Gruber? It was Sergeant Weber again, his face flushed, his eyes betraying the exhaustion of too many sleepless nights. We've made the necessary adjustments. The tank is ready for the test. Victor nodded, forcing a steely resolve to mask the uncertainty that simmered beneath the surface. Then let's begin. The convoy moved out from the village with a single objective: to test the Sherman's endurance, to push it until it could no longer function. The plan was simple, almost cruel in its bluntness. They would run the tank through a series of demanding obstacles, forcing it to traverse trenches, uneven ground, and even simulated enemy fire. Every weakness, every flaw would be exposed. Victor rode alongside the engineers in the back of a transport vehicle, his eyes fixed on the Sherman as it lumbered ahead. He could see the cloud of dust rising behind it as it rolled through the field. The tank seemed almost too calm. There was an eerie stillness to its movement, as if it was waiting, anticipating the tests it was about to endure. The convoy reached the first obstacle, a deep trench that cut across the field like a scar on the earth. It was a challenge that would normally destroy any vehicle not built to handle such terrain, but the Sherman, with its simple yet sturdy design, seemed to smile at the challenge. It revved its engine and powered through the trench, emerging on the other side with an almost mocking ease. Victor felt a chill run through him. The machine wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. The next test was a steep hill, littered with debris from the previous battles. The ground was uneven, and the incline would put tremendous pressure on the tank's engine. But again, the Sherman simply pressed forward, its treads biting into the earth, the engine roaring with life as it climbed higher and higher. The engineers cheered, their excitement growing with each successful challenge. But Victor's stomach twisted with unease. This wasn't just about the tank anymore. It was about the Germans' pride, their belief that their own machines were the pinnacle of engineering. And here was an American tank, simple, humble even, but it was performing like a beast, with a determination that Victor couldn't understand. "Lieutenant Gruber, are you all right?" It was Hauptmann Keller, his voice tinged with concern. Victor snapped out of his thoughts, his eyes meeting the engineers. "I'm fine," Victor replied curtly, though his mind was elsewhere. "Continue the tests." They moved on to the next phase, an obstacle course designed to mimic the worst conditions of the battlefield. The Sherman was to navigate a series of artificial craters, dodge simulated incoming artillery fire, and make its way through thick mud. Each challenge was meant to break it. Each test was designed to expose its weaknesses. But Victor watched as the Sherman took it all in stride. It was an unstoppable force. "Why isn't it breaking?" Weber muttered beside him, his voice strained. "It should be breaking by now. It's supposed to break." Victor glanced at him, the unease in his chest growing tighter. "We're pushing it, Sergeant, but maybe we're missing something." Weber shook his head, eyes wide. "We're not missing anything, Lieutenant. The Sherman is just different. We've seen tanks like this before. When they're pushed to their limits, they crack. But not this one. It just keeps going. It's like it has a life of its own." Victor clenched his fists, his knuckles white from the tension. Something about those words, those implications, unsettled him. Was this just a tank? A machine like any other? Or was it something more? Something that reflected the very nature of the enemy they were facing? A force that would not break, no matter how hard they tried to force it down? As the test continued, Victor noticed something else, a subtle shift in the engineers' demeanor. At first, they had been eager, even cocky, as they tore into the Sherman with their tools. But now they were more cautious, almost reverential. They had expected the tank to falter, to show signs of weakness, but it hadn't. And now there was fear in their eyes. A few hours into the test, Victor ordered a pause. The engineers were huddled together, arguing over something, their voices rising in frustration. "We're not going to learn anything if we keep pushing it," Keller said sharply, his hands shaking slightly as he held a notebook. "We need to analyze it methodically, not break it by force." "But it hasn't broken," Weber snapped, almost pleading. "That's the problem. We're testing a machine that doesn't seem to have any weaknesses. It's not supposed to be like this." The tension in the air was thick. Victor could feel the strain pressing down on him as he watched the engineers argue. It wasn't just about the tank anymore. It was about their own pride, their own understanding of what war was supposed to be. They had always believed that power and precision were enough, but here was the proof that survival, grit, and reliability could be just as lethal. Suddenly, a sound broke through the argument. It was the unmistakable rumble of the Sherman's engine as it fired back to life. The tank, which had been idle for only a few minutes, now surged forward once more, its treads moving with a determination that made Victor's skin prickle. It wasn't broken, not even close. And that was when Victor understood. The real battle wasn't going to be fought with weapons or tanks. It was going to be fought with something far more dangerous, the will to survive. The Sherman, like the Americans themselves, was not built to win in a single decisive moment. It was built to endure, to keep moving forward when everything else had fallen apart. As the engineers turned to face him, Victor felt a deep, unsettling realization settle in his gut. This was only the beginning, and something had changed. Something inside him, inside all of them. There would be no turning back. The sun had set hours ago, but the tension in the air felt like it had been hanging over them for days. The distant rumble of artillery echoed through the village, and the stillness of the night was broken only by the occasional creak of the Sherman's treads as it idled in the makeshift testing area. Yet the tank was the last thing on Viktor Gruber's mind now. The Germans had been on the defensive for months, their lines pushed back as the Allies advanced. It was no longer just a question of how they would defeat the enemy, it was a question of whether they could hold their ground at all. The Sherman, that persistent, relentless beast, had shaken something in Viktor, something deep within him. Now the conflict wasn't just mechanical, it wasn't just about breaking the Sherman apart to understand its secrets. The war had moved into a different kind of battle, one of values, of what was right, and of what was necessary to survive. As Viktor stood in the cold night air, looking at the Sherman across the yard, a sense of foreboding gnawed at him. It wasn't just the Allies they were up against anymore. There were new forces at play within the German command. A sudden voice interrupted his thoughts. "Lieutenant, come quick!" Viktor turned to find Sergeant Weber approaching, his face pale, a look of urgent concern in his eyes. "What is it?" Viktor asked, his stomach tightening. He could feel it. Something was wrong. "There's been a change in orders," Weber said, his voice tight. "It's from General Brandt. We've been ordered to move out. The Allies are advancing faster than we expected. They've detected our position. The High Command says we're to abandon the test and prepare for a retreat." Viktor's chest tightened. This wasn't just another change in plans. This was the beginning of something far worse. "Retreat?" Viktor asked, his voice low. "From this position?" Weber nodded grimly. "Yes, Lieutenant. The Allies are closing in. We can't afford to stay here any longer. Brandt says we have to abandon the Sherman. The tests. It's a lost cause. We need to fall back to defensive positions and regroup." Viktor's heart sank. The retreat was inevitable. He knew that. But the Sherman, the one thing that had piqued his curiosity, that had brought them a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak war, was now being abandoned without a second thought. It wasn't just the machine, it was everything the Sherman represented. They could leave behind the test, leave behind the promise of understanding this enduring beast, and fall back into the chaos of retreat. But there was a problem. Viktor knew something that no one else did. A few hours earlier, Keller had pulled him aside, his face pale, his voice frantic. "I've been examining the engine further, Lieutenant. This machine, it's more than we thought. It has a flaw, yes, but it's not like anything we've seen. It can be repaired, modified. We could make it work for us, better than anything the Allies have." Viktor had listened, skeptical but intrigued. The idea of turning the Sherman into a weapon for the Germans was both ridiculous and brilliant. Yet now, standing at the crossroads of this brutal war, it felt like the only chance they had left to fight back. They weren't just abandoning the tank, they were abandoning their last hope. "You can't seriously be considering this," Weber said, reading the conflicted look on Viktor's face. "This is madness. We can't change the course of this war by keeping the Sherman. We need to get out now. There's no time to waste." Viktor's mind raced. He could already feel the pressure of the decision bearing down on him. It wasn't just about the tank anymore. It was about their survival. It was about the men under his command, the weight of their lives pressing on his shoulders. The longer they stayed here, the more vulnerable they became to Allied forces. The retreat, while painful, was the only safe choice. And yet, there was something else gnawing at him. The Sherman, its quiet strength, its relentless endurance. It didn't care about the war's politics, about the banners of either side. It simply survived. Viktor had never felt such a pull before. It was as though the tank itself was calling to him, urging him to make a choice. "Viktor," Weber's voice was a whisper now, filled with urgency. "Please, you're not thinking clearly. You know what happens if we don't fall back. We'll be caught in the open, surrounded. You can't risk it. The Sherman isn't worth dying for." Viktor's mind was in turmoil. He had already lost so much in this war. Friends, comrades, a sense of hope. But this tank, this machine, it represented something he had never allowed himself to believe in, that there could be something beyond survival. Something more than the brutality, the constant pushing forward against impossible odds. The Sherman's quiet resilience spoke to him. It felt like a lifeline, even if he couldn't explain why. Before he could respond, a voice interrupted again. It was Keller, appearing out of the shadows, his face set with grim determination. "Lieutenant Gruber," he said, his voice tight. "I've been told about the orders. We are to retreat immediately. The general insists. But I believe the Sherman is more than just a test now. If we keep it, we could turn the tide. We could use it to buy us more time. Maybe even stop the Allies in their tracks. But we can't do that if we leave it behind. This is our chance." Victor stared at Keller, the weight of the decision hanging in the air between them. This wasn't just about machinery anymore. It was about his men, their lives, their future. Could they fight their way out of this using the Sherman? Could he make it work? Or was the risk too great? "Victor, what will it be?" Keller's voice was soft but insistent. "We've come this far. We can't just walk away." Victor looked out into the distance, the dark horizon lit only by the faint flicker of distant artillery fire. The storm was closing in. The noise of the retreat orders filtered through the air, soldiers rushing to pack their things, equipment clattering as they hastily prepared to abandon the position. But Victor stood still, his mind torn. The men trusted him. The engineers trusted him. They had come to him for answers, and now he had to give them one. He took a slow breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The decision felt like a knife's edge. On one side, retreat, a painful but safe choice. On the other, a desperate gamble, a chance to defy the inevitable and fight back with the very thing that had so mystifyingly survived. The Sherman wasn't just a machine. It was a symbol of survival, of persistence. And as Victor took a final glance at the tank, feeling that strange pull inside him, he knew what he had to do. "Move out," he said, his voice low but resolute. "Lieutenant?" Weber's voice wavered. "What?" Victor turned toward him, his eyes hard. "We're staying. Get the Sherman ready. We're fighting." The weight of his choice slammed into him. He had made his decision, but in that moment, something deep inside him whispered that this was no longer just a battle of men against men. This was a battle of wills, one where survival might be the only victory left. The wind howled louder now, cutting through the skeletal remains of the French village like 1,000 jagged knives. The sounds of the retreat were distant, muffled under the weight of Viktor Gruber's decision. The soldiers had started to abandon their posts, retreating towards the forest, heading for the nearest defensive line. But Victor wasn't with them. His eyes were locked on the Sherman, the tank now positioned in the center of the yard, ready for its final test. The decision had been made. There was no turning back. They were going to fight, not retreat. The Sherman would be their weapon. Around him, the engineers were scrambling to make the final preparations. Keller barked orders as men loaded spare ammunition, checked the engines, and reinforced whatever could be reinforced. There was an energy in the air now, a raw, focused determination. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the chance to do something, anything, to change the course of this war. But as the soldiers began to settle in their positions, Victor felt a heavy presence behind him. It was Sergeant Weber. His face was pale, eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and fear. "Victor," Weber began, his voice barely audible over the roar of the approaching storm, "you don't understand. This isn't just about the Sherman anymore. This is madness. The Allies are already close. Our position is untenable. If we stay here, we're dead. You can't fight them all. Please, let's retreat. Let's get out." Victor turned toward him slowly, the weight of his decision pressing down like an iron vice. The retreat would have been the right choice, the safe choice. But there was something in him that refused to let go. The Sherman had survived for so long. It had endured where other machines had failed. It had fought when it should have fallen. There was something in that, something he couldn't ignore. "We're staying," Victor said firmly, locking eyes with Weber. "Get the men in position. We'll hold the line here. Buy as much time as we can. I won't leave it behind." Weber swallowed hard but didn't argue. The look in Victor's eyes told him there was no point. He turned and walked off to rally the troops, his steps heavy with the knowledge of what they were facing. As the last of the soldiers scrambled into position, Victor approached the Sherman. He stood beside it, his hand resting lightly on its cold metal surface, feeling the vibration of the engine beneath his fingers. For a moment, it felt like the tank itself was alive, like it was waiting for something, for him. "All right," Keller's voice broke through his thoughts. "It's ready. We're as prepared as we'll ever be." Viktor nodded, turning to face the horizon. The Allies were coming. He could hear the distant thud of artillery, the faint hum of their advancing vehicles. The night was dark, and the air was thick with the promise of violence. But there was one thing Viktor had learned in this war. The darkness could be a weapon, and if they could strike first, they might have a chance. Suddenly, a series of loud explosions rang through the air, the shock waves sending a tremor through the ground. The first wave of Allied tanks had arrived. The time for waiting was over. "Position the Sherman!" Viktor shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We fight now, or we don't fight at all." The engineers scrambled into action, their hands shaking but determined. Keller climbed into the Sherman's turret, and Viktor slid into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life beneath him. The tank's powerful growl seemed to awaken the very earth beneath them. Viktor slammed the lever forward, and the Sherman surged into motion. The battlefield was a blur. Smoke billowed from the distance as Allied artillery pounded the ground, shaking the earth beneath them. Viktor steered the Sherman through the wreckage of abandoned vehicles, pushing it forward toward the advancing enemy tanks. His heart raced, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The war had always been about survival, about endurance. But now in this moment, it was about doing whatever it took to hold on. The first enemy tank appeared through the smoke, a massive M26 Pershing, its turret already swiveling toward them. Viktor's breath caught in his throat, but he didn't hesitate. With a sharp turn of the wheel, he steered the Sherman into a trench, forcing it to drop lower. The Pershing's cannon fired, but it missed by a mere inch, the blast leaving a cloud of dust where the Sherman had been. Viktor pushed forward, the Sherman's treads tearing through the mud, and opened fire. The enemy tank's hull shuddered as the round struck, but it kept coming. "Reload!" Keller shouted from above, his voice barely audible over the roar of the cannon fire. The enemy tank returned fire, and Viktor felt a jolt as their shells scraped across the side of the Sherman. The impact sent a wave of heat and pressure through the hull, but it didn't stop the tank. It kept moving, kept fighting. Viktor clenched his teeth, gripped the controls tighter, and aimed the Sherman's cannon. With a deafening explosion, the round hit the enemy tank's turret, sending a plume of smoke and debris into the night air. The Pershing faltered and fell back, its power momentarily disabled. "We did it!" Keller shouted, his voice full of disbelief. But Viktor didn't celebrate. He knew this was just the beginning. More tanks were coming. The sky above was filled with the roar of engines, the ground trembling with each new impact. Viktor's pulse quickened as he aimed the Sherman at the next oncoming wave, knowing that they had only moments to hold the line before they were overwhelmed. Suddenly, there was a shout from the rear. Viktor turned just in time to see several German soldiers scrambling toward the Sherman, their faces twisted in terror. "Lieutenant, the Allies have broken through," one of them yelled. "We're surrounded." Viktor's heart skipped a beat. They had been too focused on the battle ahead. The retreating forces had already been pushed back. They were trapped. A moment of indecision gripped him. The escape route was narrow, and the risk of being hit was high. But Viktor knew there was no other choice. The Sherman could still move. It could still fight. They had one last chance to break through. But as he began to issue the order to move out, something stopped him. It was Weber. He had run up to the tank, his eyes wide with panic. "Lieutenant, no, you can't," Weber began, but Viktor interrupted him. "We're not running anymore, Sergeant. We fight. We push through." Just as Viktor turned back toward the Sherman, the ground beneath them shook again. The Allies had hit the heart of the village with artillery fire, the explosions ripping through the earth. The Sherman jolted violently, and Viktor felt something snap within the tank's engine. No, he thought, the realization coming too late. The Sherman's engine sputtered, the treads grinding to a halt. They were dead in the water. Trapped. "Go! Get out!" Viktor shouted, turning toward the soldiers. He had to make a decision now. Leave the Sherman and save what was left of the men, or stay and fight a losing battle. But as the soldiers began to retreat, Viktor turned to Keller, his eyes locked in a silent understanding. "I'll hold them off," Viktor said, his voice calm, steady. Keller hesitated. "Lieutenant, you don't—" "I have to," Viktor interrupted. "The Sherman, this is my choice." With that, Viktor jumped out of the Sherman, his hand reaching for the nearest weapon. The soldiers had already begun their retreat, but Viktor was no longer part of that. The war had been defined by moments like this, and now he had one more chance to make a difference. He turned back to face the advancing enemy. The explosions grew louder, the sound of their engines deafening. And in that moment, as the first Allied troops broke through the smoke and dust, Viktor Gruber made his stand. Not for the tank, not for his own survival, but for the idea that maybe, just maybe, in the chaos of war, there was still something worth fighting for, something worth dying for. And he would give everything to see it through. The silence that followed the final explosion was deafening. Viktor Gruber's vision blurred as he collapsed against the wreckage of the Sherman, his breath ragged, his body bruised from the harsh impact of his fall. The battle was over. The enemy had overwhelmed their position, and now all that remained was the charred earth beneath him, the crumbled remnants of his men, and the smoke rising from the smoldering remnants of the Sherman. The last thing Viktor had seen before the final explosion had been the tank's turret, briefly illuminated by the flash of artillery fire. It was a brief, fleeting moment, like the last breath of a dying soldier who had done all he could, given everything he had. The Sherman had survived through hell, had fought with a persistence that mirrored the very essence of human endurance, but now it was gone, and with it, any hope of turning the tide. Viktor's body ached, his vision swirling, his head pounding with the sound of the distant battle now fading into the background. His legs refused to hold him up any longer, and he sank to the ground, his hand resting in the dirt as he closed his eyes. The war had taken everything from him, his friends, his ideals, and now his last desperate hope. The Sherman had been a symbol of resilience, but in the end, it had been destroyed just as everything else was. Viktor had tried to fight with it, to defy the inevitable. But even the Sherman couldn't defy the tide of history. The wind whispered around him, the cold creeping into his bones. But it was not the cold that made Viktor shiver. It was something deeper. It was the realization that there was nothing left. No more battles to fight. No more victories to claim. But then, as his hand brushed against the remnants of the Sherman's turret, he remembered something. The very reason he had chosen to stay, to fight when all seemed lost. It wasn't about victory. It wasn't about the Sherman's survival or the German forces' superiority. It was about something far more elemental. It was about endurance. Through the storm of fire and smoke, the Sherman had not stopped. It had kept moving, kept pushing forward, and though it had eventually fallen, it had done so with purpose. And in that purpose, Viktor found something that, in the end, gave him peace. A distant voice broke through his thoughts. It was Sergeant Weber approaching cautiously, his face grim but not without a sense of recognition. He had been one of the few to make it out, and as he came closer, Viktor could see the silent grief in his eyes. He had fought beside Viktor, had seen the same struggles, the same hope that had driven them all to stand their ground. "Weber!" Viktor's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. Weber crouched beside him, his expression somber but understanding. He didn't need to ask about the others. He knew what had happened. They had all known what would happen. "They're gone," Viktor said quietly. "We didn't make it. It wasn't enough." Weber shook his head, his eyes darkened with something Viktor couldn't place. "It wasn't about making it, Viktor. We didn't die for nothing. You made a choice. You gave us a chance, even when we had no right to hope. We held that line as long as we could." Viktor blinked, confused by the unexpected words. "But we lost. The Sherman's gone. We're lost." "No." Weber's voice was firm. "We didn't lose. We did what we had to do. You chose to fight when others would have turned tail and fled. That's what matters." Viktor stared at him for a long moment, his mind trying to process what he was hearing. In a war that had torn apart everything he had believed in, everything he had known, Weber's words were the first thing that felt real. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Viktor realized that perhaps it wasn't the victory or defeat that mattered. It was the fact that they had chosen to endure, to fight when they were cornered, to give everything to something that felt worth the fight. They had done what they could, and that was enough. The next few hours passed in a blur. Viktor sat quietly, his mind grappling with the weight of the loss, yet also grasping for the remnants of something that felt like purpose, like meaning. The Germans would retreat, and they would lose again. The war would continue, with new battles and new deaths. But Victor knew he had made a stand that few would ever make. He had held on. And as the sun began to rise the next morning, casting a dim light across the battlefield, Victor's mind wandered back to the Sherman. Not as a machine, but as a symbol of enduring through the impossible. The war wasn't just fought on the fields of battle, it was fought in the hearts of men like him, who refused to give up when everything told them to. As the remnants of the German forces began to regroup and retreat, Victor stood, his knees shaking, but his resolve steady. He would leave this battlefield, but he would not forget it. The war would consume him, as it had consumed everything. But the spirit of that Sherman, the resilience, the refusal to be broken, would stay with him, and he would carry it with him long after the war was over. There was always a chance to survive, no matter how slim, no matter how fleeting. And in that, there was hope. Historical note: this story was inspired by the experiences of German engineers who, after capturing a number of American M4 Sherman tanks during World War II, were stunned by their durability and ease of repair compared to the more complex German tanks. One of the more well-documented cases involved a captured Sherman tank that, despite suffering heavy damage, continued to function and was eventually tested by German engineers, who could not replicate its reliability. The Sherman was designed to be rugged and simple, embodying the American philosophy of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds.